I'd like to thank everybody for actually coming back after lunch somewhat promptly. I know it's always a challenge with the session right after lunch, and I thank you for coming back. I think this panel will be really interesting, building on some of the themes actually that we heard this morning. There was a lot of discussion of informal learning as well as formal learning and what the relationship between those two things is. And I think this panel's focus on informal learning will add a lot to that conversation. I myself have mostly done formal education, and for a while I've kind of envied the informal educators who had the kind of the option of kind of working with an audience that wants to be there, unlike us in formal education that don't always have that as the case, and they don't have to give students the state test, which the students hate. But recently, over the last couple of years, through some of our wireless and handheld work, I've had the opportunity to work with museums and nature centers and informal education environments and other situations, and realized just how hard it is to actually work in those environments when people can leave after 30 seconds if they don't like what they see, or leave at any time if it's not kind of capturing their interest and motivation. It's harder to get feedback from them because they don't have to take the test in order to pass museum or pass website viewing. But it's a really fun and a great challenge, and it's an environment that I like to work in and think about ways that it does relate to formal education as well as ways that it stands on its own. So I've kind of actually framed, without going through the individual questions, I've kind of framed a little bit of a context in terms of what informal learning can do for games. If we look to informal learning environments for how they've been able to capture interest at the same time that they're educating the people that are participating in those activities, I think that we can learn a lot in game design as to how they've done that. At the same time, we can think about what games can do for informal learning. I'll come back to a topic that came up this morning, which is this idea of maybe games that relate to between informal and formal learning being played outside of formal learning environments. And I would argue actually that I think that if we kind of think about what are the kinds of things that kids like to do in their playtime and create sort of educational games that take advantage of that, at the same time they're doing what they want to do and do things that are very playful, that we should look at those opportunities as quite interesting opportunities. So we have a great panel that's established here from all different kinds of learning environments that they're representing that still talk more about themselves. But I do want to say, because we're actually going to go in a slightly different order than perhaps is on the program, first we'll start with Ted Koterwas from the Exploratorium, Howard Cutler from WGBH Interactive, David Williamson Shaffer from the University of Wisconsin, and finally Scot Osterweil from TERC. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ted.
Oh, it magically went over. Okay. So I'm going to first apologize to any music instructors out there. I'm going to start off with a song. Can I get that a lot louder? Louder. Okay, so quickly I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a minute. And I want you to imagine your high school marching band playing that song. And while you're imagining this, be sure you include the flutes, the tubas, the glockenspiel. Now, and again, apologies to any band instructors out there that might actually have used that song before. But that's a really tame and now pretty mainstream song. But still, when you imagine it in that context of a high school band actually playing it, it really does get stripped of a lot of its original power. Just imagine now that the marching band is playing some of the more subversive, antisocial, whatever you want to call it, things that the kids are listening to today. I was pretty inspired actually by the earlier conversation, and I want to just add in a little bit about why I actually play the game Unreal. It's a first-person shooter, pretty violent. And it's because the very things that game allows me to do are subversive. And they're subversive at least to my normal identity, which of course is informed and normed by societal values. It is really a guilty pleasure. I only play Unreal when my 3-year-old daughter is asleep or when she's not around. And that's not just because the content of a violent video game seems really inappropriate for a 3-year-old, but because the projective identity I adopt in the game is pretty antithetical to my identity as a role model for her. Going around shooting with rockets and ion painters and so on and so forth. But the game is really an escape from what I value and what is valued by me and my social circles, and that's why it's really, really fun. So obviously I share some of the concerns that came up earlier about killing games by valuing them too much and by giving them social legitimacy, especially from those of us who are over 30. It's a classic, there's a punk statement about trusting people over 30. And I'm also really glad that the issue of power came up, because I think that power is really key here, and who holds power in a game and who holds it in real life is actually a really key issue that we should be addressing if we're looking at educational games. I do think that what came out of that earlier discussion, what Jim G had said about learning from the games and taking features that seem especially compelling or have a lot of potential for learning, is a really valuable way to proceed. And so what I'm going to talk today about is reflecting a little bit on the exhibit design in a museum like the Exploratorium, a hands-on museum. And I'm going to do this through a case study, and it's actually a fairly unsexy exhibit that designed a couple years ago. I'm going to talk about two things that this exhibit shares with a game. To preface that, we're talking about informal education, and museums actually are weird because they're right in the middle. It's not completely informal, self-directed learning, street-based learning, and it's not classroom-based. We're still designing activities, and we're still designing an environment for people to engage. The reality, though, is that they come in of their own accord, and they also engage in a self-directed way. So we're setting up this cognitive frame for them that's already established, but they're freely engaging in what we do. And so engagement with the museum exhibit, I don't know if you've been to the Exploratorium, but we have a lot of stuff. I mean, it's really dynamic, a lot of things to play with. And getting people involved with anyone requires some sort of prompt, and this could be very easy to do, and this can also be very challenging to do. To prompt their engagement with the learning activity that we've set up. And I would say the more informal the environment, the more compelling this prompt or this motivation to get engaged can become. And then also key to any educational activity, especially in an informal environment, is reflection. If we want people to learn from it, they need to be able to reflect, and we need to be able to design, or at least try to get people, or at least support people, the ability for people to reflect on, I'm sorry, I'm kind of nervous, reflect on the activity that they just did. And so whether we're designing games or museum exhibits, and they're different things. I'm not going to say that an exhibit is a game, and there's really important differences, especially in context, intent, and authenticity. But the critical thing is that we're supporting that reflection on the activity. So the case study I'm going to show is an exhibit at the Exploratorium. It shares two features with games. The first feature is using a challenge as a prompt, issuing a challenge to the visitor to get them engaged in the exhibit. And the second is the potential of competition as a way to motivate and make the exhibit more meaningful. And I've already given the caveat that museum exhibits are not games. However, a lot of the exhibits we do are grounded in the same constructivist learning theories that we see as the potential in educational games. So I think that looking at some common features can optimize the impact of both. I'm also going to talk about a digital exhibit. That's what I do at the Exploratoriums. It's what I have the most knowledge about, and we're also talking about digital games. So the example I'm going to show is an exhibit called Change Blindness. It's based on the work of Ron Rensing, the psychologist. And it's launching. Still launching, okay. So as the tagline says, each time that the image blinks, something changes. So what I want you to do is take a minute and try to see the changes. And you're probably not going to be able to. Okay, so now I'd like to try something. Okay, in a moment I'm going to say go, Okay, that's in a moment. I'm going to say go. And then what I want you to do is I want you to raise your hand in the audience each time that you see one of the things change, each time you see a change. And I want you to keep mental track of how many you're seeing. Okay, so ready? Not that one, go. Raise your hand high. Okay, stop. Who saw them all? Who thinks they saw the most? Oh, come on, don't be shy. Who thinks they really did good at this? Celia said that she saw. Oh, you can stop now, Celia. Although she gets extra credit for those couple extra. So now you've done it kind of twice. You've done it once as sort of an individual experience, and you've done it one as a collective experience that might have actually had some implicit competition with it, because you're actually raising your hand, people are saying that you're raising the hand. And so I want you to think a little bit about those two cases and ask a couple of questions. And I need to scroll down to see those questions, so give me a second. Oh, can you not see? Oh, okay. Also, I'm just sharing my working notes here. So in which case were you having more fun, do you think? And again, just think about these to yourselves. I'm not asking you to say anything. Which experience felt more like a game? Which one did you feel more motivated to actually see each change? Which one did it feel more like a personal challenge? And which ones were you more likely to think about how it's relevant to your everyday experience? And then in which case were you likely to ask why the challenge was difficult, or to reflect on what was making it difficult? So in the very beginning of designing this exhibit, we did a sort of test, and using that word lightly. And so we used the original red-synced images, and these were actually an image and then the image slightly altered, going back and forth over one change with the blink. And what we found, and we put this out on a computer out on the museum floor, and people would come by and we'd talk to them about it. And so groups automatically made it competitive, right? And they'd take a lot of pride in saying, I saw it, you know, and then we'd move on to the next one. And then, you know, someone would say, I saw it. And those who were slow and didn't see it all the time said things like, well, I'm not very good at things like this. You know, I don't really see very well. And of course, that's not really the point of the exhibit. The point of the exhibit is that it's hard for everybody. We don't see, we're all pretty bad at this, and there's a very particular reason that we're bad about this, the way that we see. But in this competitive version, no one really asked why that was. What was it about the way that we see? So it became more personal for people. They said things about themselves and their own ability to see. I'm not very good at this, or I am good at this. But it didn't prompt them really to ask why they weren't good at it, or ask any sort of content questions. So on the museum floor, it's a projection probably about the size that you saw up there. It's got a podium in front and actually we take the tagline and put it on the podium itself in big letters. They're backlit so people see it. So it's actually a bit of a mystery when you walk up to it that you have this blinking image and what's going on, but when you walk up to the podium, it's there. We offer a couple of buttons for interaction. Let me launch it again. The first is, well, actually, I don't need to do that. First is to see the last thing that changed. So it'll show you when you press a button the last change. It can remove the blink entirely, and actually I think I'm going to change my mind and show that. Sorry, I shouldn't have. Okay, so right there you see that. That car changed. So I'm just pressing the button to show what changed. That's a pretty subtle one, but still. Right in the middle of the picture, and so on and so forth. The tree changes at sometimes. And what we've done is we've taken one image and progressively changed it into a completely new image. Another button allows you to remove the blink. And now if you try it, you can notice it's a bit easier. In fact, a whole lot easier. Okay, and then there's a button that allows you to see the last full image and how many changes have been made. Okay, so the engagement we're actually hoping for here is that a visitor comes up and they're issued a challenge, bet you can't see it. It's sort of like, nah, 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 nah. The challenge is a lot more difficult than they would actually expect. Seeing something change in a big image seems like it would be pretty easy. We're hoping that this leads to the question, why is it more difficult? And we're giving them a couple of tools to see why it would be more difficult. And so people generally will either read the text in the exhibit graphic or try the buttons, removing the blink. They get at the potential scope of the failure by seeing the whole, how many things have changed and that there are several big things that change. And we're trying to prompt transfer to everyday experience by using a street scene, an everyday scene that's near life size. It's a large projection. We're using things like cars, and we're using common language such as blink and attention. I don't know. And then what generally happens is I do call people over and they want other people to see what's going on, and some sort of competition sometimes happens. And the reflection that we're hoping for is that first of all, it's difficult to see the changes. Removing the blink, if you do that, makes it easy to see the changes, so it must be the blink. The blink distracts us momentarily, so it must be something to do with distraction. So the inverse is true, that it requires attention to see. And then if you further investigate, there's several things that you can do, but if you, for instance, take a strategy of looking at one area of the image and really intensely focusing on that, that eventually you'll see that change. And we can only pay attention to one thing at a time. We only see what we pay attention to. And then even further reflection, if we're, we have the holy grail of like 2% of people who actually go through this whole thing. They may transfer it to real life. When would something like this happen? Well, driving is certainly a case. With windshield wipers, it's the case that about the majority of auto accidents actually happen or are caused by something right in your visual field, right in front of you. And so we're trying to support that, throughout our use of media, our use of images, and the types of interactions somebody can do. I already talked a little bit of the cognitive frame. I'm going to just speak real quickly about a challenge and then speak a little bit about competition, then I'll hand it over. I have a little section that I was going to talk about what can we take from games to make better exhibits, but maybe we can save that for a Q&A. And then also why, some of those reasons why games and exhibits, and I would even argue some activities in informal education, are necessarily different things. So first, what is a challenge? A challenge defines a goal. Jane's presentation, identified that right away too. It's issuing a challenge, and it has to be a meaningful challenge. There's a sense of difficulty, even if it is much more difficult than what you actually expect it'll be. It gives a sense of, the challenge gives a sense of how one might achieve this goal. And again, it's meaningful, it motivates. If you carry that line to its conclusion, it seems to me we have a lot of exhibits that actually ask people to predict an outcome or to make a hypothesis, but those don't actually seem like challenges to me. And the reason is because the answer generally is not necessarily a meaningful goal, right? It's not something that I need right away in order to actually do something to reach a meaningful goal. We use challenges and exhibits as a prompt. It's a tool to make someone ask why something is difficult. It's a tool for motivating people to practice a skill, and it can be a tool for scaffolding learning. We give increasingly, iteratively more difficult challenges. And then finally, competition motivates engagements in the competitive activity itself, but maybe not necessarily in the reflective activity. It makes the challenge more personal. It can scope the challenge. When you look around and no one's raising their hand, you kind of get a sense that, oh, this is really hard. But finally, it can distract from or even misguide the reflection and transfer from the exhibit. And I'm going to hand it over with that.
Thanks. I missed it all. I mean, the changes. Maybe it's the small monitor. I'm Howard Cutler. I'm from WGBH in Boston. I should probably define this a little more narrowly. We aren't all of public broadcasting, but we are a pretty big chunk of it. And I just thought I would try to quickly, without sort of getting into a lot of the theory or demoing give you a snapshot of where we are with games in Boston in terms of sort of what they mean in our overall line of work. And then maybe in the question and answer we can come back if you want to go sort of more deeply into pieces of this. But in a sense, my goal is to get you to sort of look at games in terms of the constraints that we're dealing with, some of which are huge opportunities, not constraints. We do about 35% of the primetime PBS TV programming that goes out nationally. And we do about 33% on average of the traffic to pbs.org and pbskids.org. Those are some of the program brands that we're known for, except that one's changed its name. The other thing about WGBH is interesting is that we work across a huge range of media. A lot of what we make never hits broadcast. A lot of what we make does hit broadcast. We have a lot of archival material that's organized by metadata, both from production and also finished programming that's gone out. We do a lot of broadband, and VOD is becoming increasingly important to anybody who's in the television business. And we also do a lot of work with accessibility. We help develop captioning and a lot of other technologies that help people who have one kind of impairment or another to use media. In terms of the reach we get on the web, the bigger picture is that all of we have our own website, but the deep editorial content goes on to pbs.org, and that does about 4.2 billion page views last year. And the other interesting thing about this is it has about a 30% growth rate, and since public television on air is going the other direction, that's kind of an interesting trend to think about. And I already said we're sort of the largest single source of that content. And a lot of what we do is hugely popular. So most of the games that we do are on the children's sites, and overall you're dealing with 5 million people coming in a month. So it's a lot of traffic. And equally important, the sites that we've built in association with the programs have a tendency to be highly visible on Google. For instance, if you search DNA on Google, you'll get a little widget that we built for a series called A Science Odyssey. You'll get Frontline's Jesus to Christ on the first page. If you search evolution, you'll get the evolution site as #1. So these things have a way, there's a kind of a synergy between the way the original broadcast promotes the site and gets that on people's radar, and then they go to it and they link to it and the engines notice it. And over time, these things develop a very robust long tail life. I just want to touch on this. We're talking about informal learning. All of this stuff is built in informal learning, but kind of the reverse of what you were saying, Eric, is we get happy when it gets used in formal settings. And there's a couple of reasons. One, that helps us get more funding, but also it's one of the few places we can actually we actually can set up a structure to evaluate. Because one of the real problems with doing informal learning is you can tell people are using it, but what they're coming away from it with is pretty hard to figure out. But these are just some of the ways that programs we've done have sort of gotten themselves inserted into formal curriculum in one way or another. This is the one I mentioned that has the little DNA widget. This site gets more traffic now than it did when the site was on air, and it keeps growing every year. So we suddenly have to switch our whole way of thinking from going from like television folks who produce something completely ephemeral that disappears and you're on to the next thing, and now you have a garden and you have to think about tending that garden, and that has that affects so many things, from the accounting structure of the business to the whole life cycle costing of projects. So there's a major sort of transition underway in which it's sort of, I think, for many stations, very hard to recognize that if they get entrenched trying to defend the television-centric model of public broadcasting, they may be backing the wrong horse here. Although the numbers, to be honest, the numbers are still, considerably higher on the broadcast end. one of the projects I've worked with lately doesn't involve gaming at all, but does have some relevance to this, which is I've gotten very involved with the idea of translating whole programs onto the web with a lot more content that was assembled. You know, if you take $5 or $6 million in 4 years and make 8 hours of a program, and you have a lot of other stuff that's really not being utilized well, and it's also not packaged in a form that's particularly useful in schools. So making it searchable, making it granular into small chapters, and we've begun to do some real serious evaluation, not only of the way it's used informally, but the way it's used formally, and it does seem like these are tools that are powerful. And one of the next steps is, how does gaming fit into that? Most of the gaming, though, that we're doing now, as I said, is involved with the kids' world. And to give you some idea of what that is, here's the Arthur site. If any of you have kids that are, I don't know, that in the past 10 years, if they've been through the age range of about 4 to 8, you probably know this program. It was huge. It was, for many years, the most watched children's animated television program. This site launched in 1996. Nobody quite understood why we would really want to do that, and I think we started with $15,000, and here it is all this time later, still doing 6 million visits a month. And if you look at that proportion of the games, every one of those page views is a game that's been asked for, so that's pretty massive. And I'll talk about the nature of these games in a minute. It has an offshoot series called Buster's Postcards, and Buster's got kind of strangely famous in the past few months. Some of you may be aware as, I guess, the poster child for same-sex couples. We had responded to an RFP from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Department of Ed about teaching diversity, but I guess we got a little too diverse. But that's a new site, and it's obviously has much lower visitation, but even with only a couple of games, you look at the proportion. I mean, it's no secret, if you put the word game on the homepage, guess where the kids are going to go. But they really do teach, and all of these games, I think they're sort of like bonbons in a way. They're not deep, complex, you know, multiplayer games. They're short shots, but each of them, you know, they have an entertainment value, but they definitely have a learning component. Arthur is pretty much a series about socialization more than anything else. So the games tend to be character-based. Some of them are critical thinking, maybe you could call it that, but certainly being able to sort and categorize and move your brain a little quicker. Some of them are just simulation types, like this is DW, Arthur's younger sister, and she's got a little music machine there that you can put everything in the pans and see how it sounds. I won't bother to take you through this now. You can go to the site. But we do sometimes play with more tightly with the relationship of television to these games, in the sense that there's a whole plot of one episode based around this game called Virtual Goose, which all of the kids on Arthur get hooked on playing. And so you can actually go play it yourself, and it's a little pattern recognition game that this still does not give you the sense of its addictively irritating music and the way the dials spin and the way the goose quacks and looks in every direction. But I guarantee you, if you play it, you'll get it. It really does. It's both addictive and it does have a learning component. Buster's games are a little different because Buster's a cartoon character who operates in the real world and goes and meets real people. So his games tend to be involved with kind of broadening cultural horizons. This is a very simple kind of matching game where you're playing him. All of these have a lot of sound, which I'm not playing for you, to keep the continuity and the flow. So you come out of this one knowing something about different foods and different cultures. Then there's Zoom, which is aimed a little bit higher in age range. It's tweens, young tweens. All of these audiences skew younger and younger as time goes on. This is a site that's almost entirely kid-developed content. If you can read small there, it says 4 million kids have contributed content to it since it launched. In fact, the games are almost the only thing on it that the kids did not create. And but the games are built with money from the National Science Foundation, and they tend to be simulations that allow you to try experiments. And I don't have time to show them to you, but you may want to go look at that. And Just as an example, there's sort of a balloon car test you can do yourself. There's a good pendulum experiment. There's a great sort of pour water in the glasses and figure out how it changes the sound tone. And the physics is explained behind it, but it's based on prediction models. I'm sort of running out of time, so I probably won't go through the rest of it at this point, other than to say that we are building things. Oops, I don't want to go back to the beginning again, do I? Hold a moment. Don't want to go there either. I want to go to the sorter. And I want to go there. Obviously, there's a lot of parent and teacher information that go with these sites for adults that want to come in and figure out how to use them. We do a lot of early literacy work with this series, Between the Lions. These games are all designed for kids who can't really read the site yet, so there's a lot of sound to guide you to the word recognition. And we've begun working outside of the PBS environment for a series of reasons, which we can talk about later if you want to. But this program is actually produced for Discovery, and it does physics for the 3 to 5-year-old set. And it's pretty interesting building mouse-driven games for that level of of dexterity and lapware. But again, though its audience is smaller, it's doing quite nicely. And finally, we do some work that isn't tied to television at all, where the folks in the interactive group just decided they really wanted to build some characters that they didn't have to inherit from someone else. And so this site, which is hugely game-driven, is a sort of a mystery game site that's gradually been attracting its audience from all over the world just by being on the web. It gets a lot less, but it's still working, and it's attracted some sponsorship from the National Geographic. The last thing I'll say quickly is what's coming up next. We have a series based on a John Cheska series of books basically designed for 4th grade boys called the Time Warp Trio. We have put some girl characters into the story. We hope we haven't lost its ability to attract what John calls the knuckleheads. He grew up with 4 brothers. Curious George is coming in 2006, and another live, not a spin-off of Zoom, but an evolution of a program funded by the NSF that same production team is working on, comes after that. And then last, what are we doing for the adults? And here is a kind of a more serious application of games and sims, which is that we're doing in 2006 a comprehensive history of the AIDS pandemic, and we're doing quite a bit of work trying to develop simulations that will allow people to understand the alternate futures by trying out different variables to see what happens. What this is leading us to more and more, and this is sort of comes from the Commanding Heights work, is that the more that we integrate any of this stuff with the actual narrative of the program, the more use it gets. It turns out that if we embed the television program in the site, not only do you get a lot of people watching the show, but you get more people using the other materials as well. So more contextualization is better, and that means that whenever you're playing the video, you have a chapter player which allows you to do live links. And we also are embedding new tools inside. Most of these things we build in Flash or Shockwave at this point, so that they're universally available, and better tools that can let us see what's going on inside the rich media activity in much greater detail than just seeing how many of them are being downloaded from the HTML stats. I'll stop there for now.
I'll wait till, is my mic on? Okay, yes, good. All right, so I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. I'm not going to talk necessarily about my own work, although if I manage to talk fast enough, hopefully I'll leave a little time for that. So broadly speaking, this is the problem, not AT&T Wireless necessarily, but the fact that we have kids who are growing up in a world that technology is making substantially different than it was before. 20 years ago, kids can now do things easily that 20 years ago university professors couldn't. And there are 2 things that might follow from this. One is the idea that, in fact, we have a very different educational landscape. There are literally different things that kids need to know and be able to do, ways they need to think and ways they need to be in order to survive in the world. And on the other hand, we have a school system that fundamentally doesn't want to change. As Hayek and Cuban argued many years ago now in Tinkering Toward Utopia, it would be unwise to underestimate the force of the pedagogical past, the difficulty of changing the basic institutional forms, the grammar that organizes the central work of school. And of course, the grammar that organizes the central work of school was laid down quite some time ago, 100 to 150 years ago. And the central grammar of the school is basically the central grammar of the factory. Right? And the model of the two is essentially the same. You take the things that people need to be able to know or need to be able to do, and you cut them up into tiny little bits of skills and things that you have to do in the factory, little bits of knowledge, and sometimes little bits of skills in school. And you do them over and over again, repeatedly, to produce some larger product. Now, as you can imagine, this doesn't fit very well with a world that's based on new technologies and the games that go with them. Why? Because people argue games are informal, games are fun, games are on demand and available anytime, anywhere. At least that's what Eric suggested they should be when we were putting together our talk here. And so I'd like to take a couple minutes and look at that idea and how those two things might fit together. And in a sense, to problematize this. So first of all, I'd like to argue that games are not informal. Games are very formal. Every game has a set of rules. That's part of what makes it a game, right? And part of the fun of playing the game, to the extent that playing a game is fun, comes from playing by the rules and sometimes playing against the rules, figuring out your way around them and within them to accomplish the thing that you want to accomplish. The second point, that games are fun, I'd also like to take that on for a moment because, as Lev Vygotsky argues, pleasure is not the defining characteristic of play. Think about all the times when you're playing a game where things that are happening that are not fun. The game as a whole may be fun, but it's not one continuous experience of fun. In fact, Vygotsky, one of the most famous developmental psychologists, argues that what's going on in games, in play, is that a child creates an imaginary situation, and play is the realization in play form of tendencies that cannot be immediately gratified. In other words, play is about needs and desires. Right? Play is a way of taking something that we can't do in the real world and finding an imaginary world where we can go through that set of experiences and learn something in the process. In other words, games work by creating worlds. They create virtual worlds or imaginary worlds that we can inhabit. But this, in this case a little screenshot from SimCity, this is not the virtual world that games create. This is the virtual world that games create. Just as this is not really the game that you play. This is a game engine. This is the game that you play. This is the game system. Or for those of you who want to preserve the word game for the thing that comes in the box, we might call one of them a little g game and the other one a big G game. The thing that you're really playing when you're playing the game. And the reason this distinction is important is because when you're playing a big G game, you're participating in a culture. A game is always about a culture. It always is a culture. And what I mean by that is that when you're playing a big G game, when you're playing when you're actually playing the game, when you're inhabiting that virtual world, you're taking on a particular set of identities. You're being a particular kind of person. And with those identities come a set of practices. There are things that you do as the person who holds that identity in the game. Now, with those practices, in order to do those things, to be that kind of person, you have to know stuff. You have to know terms of art, specific language that you would use in that context. You have to know about how things relate to one another. But in addition, you have to have a certain set of values. You have to care about particular things in particular ways in order to be able to use that knowledge to enact the practices to take on the identity and be in a certain way. And the glue that holds all those things together is epistemology. Big fancy word, right? But what it means is a way of thinking, a way of deciding how you know something. That any culture has a particular epistemology, a particular way of thinking that ties together values, knowledges, practices, and identities. You can think about that little set as something that I call an epistemic frame. Right? It's essentially the lenses that you use to view the world when you're participating in a particular culture, when you're being a particular kind of person in a particular kind of setting. Now, That's true for the casino. That is, you have a particular epistemic frame when you're participating as a casino gambler. But it's also true for subcultures, for games, for practices in the world that we might consider more socially desirable. Now, such as, for example, medicine or law or architecture or many other professions. Now, I'm using the word profession here in a particular way. I'm using what I would call small p profession. And I'm doing this based on work by Don Schoen that some of you know. Now, Schoen was actually looking at the big P professions, medicine, law, and so forth. But what he was talking about in studying the professions were places where people act in a realm of uncertainty. And therefore, it requires them to use judgment and to have a particular amount of autonomy. Now, anything that anybody does in the world has a certain amount of this small p professionalism. Some places have more than others. Factories have very little. The operating room has a fair amount, especially if you're the surgeon. Schoen's argument was that anytime people are, oops, that's the wrong click. Anytime people are operating in this way, they're thinking in a particular way that he refers to as reflection and action. And what he means by that is thinking that reshapes what we're doing while we're doing it. In other words, professions don't separate the doing of things, the skills, and the knowing that goes with it, as well as the values and the identities and so forth. Ways of knowing and ways of doing are linked together in the profession. And the place that that linkage gets made, the way that people learn to reflect in action, to think like a professional, in the small p sense, tends to be in practica. And a practica is just a technical term for a simulation of the conditions of practice, where somebody takes action and then systematically reflects on that action with peers and mentors, and that action and reflection get closer and closer together until the ways of knowing and the ways of doing get bound together. The argument is that in this practicum, you have a particular set of ways of doing things and a particular set of ways of talking about them and thinking about them that make this epistemic frame, this way of thinking of that practice. Wrong click again, sorry. And my argument is that what we can do, one of the things that games can do is simulate these practica. That is, we can take the needs and abilities and interests of kids and use technology to give them access to these ways of doing and ways of knowing in the world that we value. We can create what I would call an epistemic game. That is, a game that gives kids access to these goggles that professionals have. Now, we've seen some people talking about examples of things like this already. We could do it with journalism. We haven't seen people talk about that. We could certainly do it with crime scene investigation. In fact, we could do it with a range of practices in the world. Let me just quickly, I think, how much time do I have left, Eric? Okay. No, I'll save it for later. No, I won't. I'm going to do it now. Did that do what I thought it was going to do? Okay. I have no idea where I am. So I guess I am going to do it later. Something is happening. Right. So the idea, I guess I'm not going to show you that data. So the idea is that an epistemic game is a game that recreates the epistemic frame of a valued social practice. Now, in saying that, let me point out that school is an epistemic game too. School is a way of creating a particular epistemic frame. What's not so clear is that the epistemic frame of school is a practice that we find particularly interesting. Now, the reason that we get stuck doing this over and over again, well, let me show you a little graphic explanation. So school we can imagine is in what I would call a stable local minimum. So let's imagine that squiggly line is a graph. Okay, and the x-axis of the graph is all the different possible ways you could learn something. And the y-axis is how good it is. And school is somewhere where, say, that orange dot is. It's in a stable spot. And if you perturb the system a little bit, if you perturb it a little bit to what would be your right, it'll tend to settle back into the comfortable place where it was. And if you perturb it a little too much, like the little dot on the left there, it'll tend to go into cascade failure. And the problem is, it's very hard to figure out how to get out of the stable state and into some state that might be better. There's no way to get to that red dot by crossing the terrain in between. You have to somehow jump from one state to the other. And that's the promise that I think after school programs and other informal environments present. They're an opportunity to play more interesting epistemic games, show the value that they might have, and let us consider what we actually want to do with an educational system. You know, let's imagine for a moment that that gray blob there on the screen is all the stuff that we want kids to get out of their education. All the skills we want them to have, all the things we want them to know, all the things we want them to care about. And actually, I would expect that if you asked most kids in middle and high school what the curriculum looks like, that blob is probably a pretty good description of how they see it. We currently cut that blob up. We cut it up into history and math and science and languages, into the traditional disciplines. What the idea of epistemic games let us do is imagine a very different way of carving it up. Carving it up based on professions and other valued communities in the world, letting kids do things that are meaningful to them, grounded in meaningful activity, and create meaningful ways of thinking in the world. Merlin Donald, a psychologist, argues that a career or a vocation is just a role-playing game extended over an adult lifetime. And what this view gives us is an opportunity to imagine a system in which students learn to work and thus to think as doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, journalists, and other valued people in the world, not in order to train them for these pursuits in the traditional sense of vocational education, but rather because learning to work in such professions provides students with an opportunity to learn about the world in a variety of ways that are grounded in meaningful activity and well aligned with the skills, habits, and understandings of a post-industrial society. In other words, epistemic games carried out, at least for the moment, in after-school programs make it possible to imagine a really different, much more interdisciplinary, much more engaged, much more meaningful configuration of learning as a whole. So I'll stop there. There's a website that has some papers and so forth, and I'm happy to yak on about some of the specifics if people have questions. Thanks.
I'm Scot Osterweil. I work at TERC, which is a R&D center in Cambridge that develops math and science education materials. But in fact, my own background, I'm an alumnus of WGBH. My own background was in television and animation, and the work that I do at TERC is all around game design. And the games that we do, although they have a root in some of the learning theory and practice that other people at TERC work on, are really designed just as games. And so as I'm talking about informal learning, to me, I'm really just talking about the kind of games that are bought in boxes and sold in, to children and parents. One of the things that I also should say that, so I'm not an educator, I'm sort of a fellow traveler with a lot of educators, but I've been there a long time. One of the things I've learned from them is it's a common strategy if you're going to talk about something is to tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Well, I'm going to tell you what I was going to tell you, because one of the things that you realize when you come to a conference like this is a lot of the things you thought you were going to say end up getting said earlier, and there's really no point in repeating yourself. Sometimes, or repeating other people. Sometimes in fact, right through David's presentation there's one more thing I had to cross off because it's already said. The other thing is that your understanding and expectations of the audience changes. So my starting point was the question that Eric posed to us: how can we use games to better link formal and informal learning environments that include schools, after-school clubs, museums, and the home? And my first response to that was somehow the phrase that you've seen on bumper stickers flashed in my mind: subvert the dominant paradigm. I didn't want to, my first thought was, I don't want to think about how my game relates to school, and I thought about that for all the reasons that have been brought up in the audience, right up through David's mention of schools as factories. And I have my own experience of watching a son just graduate high school, a highly motivated, fairly accomplished kid who nevertheless memorized his way through the courses that he wasn't interested in and only worked hard on the ones he was. And I thought about the statistic I learned while working at TERC, where people do a lot of math education development. Something like 7% of the populace, once they've graduated high school, feels competent at math. We have a system which it does develop some good mathematicians. In fact, the hardest people to get to change math education are the mathematicians, because it worked for them. They love what they got out of math, and they say, why should it be any different from what produced me, a mathematician? Well, if you think about it, what kind of system has 93% of us spending time on a subject that we're going to end up feeling competent at and not use? I mean, what was the point of all that? So that was what I was going to talk about as a way of distancing games from school. But a lot of that's been said, and as I thought about it, I realized that I want to just put a slightly different perspective on it. part of getting to work with schools and with teachers, one of the things I understand is the problem isn't schools per se. That in fact, throughout the country, there are a fairly high percentage of educators have always been open to a different way of looking at it. And if you, it is there are bad teachers and they're bad schools that want to do it the way they've always done it. There are a tremendous number of teachers and schools that would like to be different. In fact, there is in the audience, and I won't say her name because she asked me not to, but there's a 7th grade science teacher in this audience. And she can speak quite eloquently about what teachers really want to accomplish with their students. But if you look at No Child Left Behind and high stakes testing, you know that and parents who want their kids to go to Harvard, and who want to see SAT scores that reflect, that are going to get them in, you know that it's really all of society that is forcing schools to be the way they are, to produce those 7% that are going to be mathematicians. And so it's all well and good for me, a game designer, to wash my hands of schools, but in fact, I think it's much better to try to speak, as we speak in these venues, to talk about reforming the whole society, not just the schools, because it isn't the schools. And a related thing that I also was going to say, but it has been said in spades, is sort of honoring the creativity and accomplishment of kids in the way they play games. There's no question about that. I really do believe that schools should be a place where every kid is working on their own projects by themselves, with a teacher as a coach, and that kids can do amazing things. But if all we do is privilege the resourcefulness of kids on their own, we tend to play, unintentionally I think, we tend to play into a dichotomy which says, that tells kids that the world that they create is good, the world around them is bad, and well, much of the world around them is bad. Sometimes that message is delivered by commercial interests who would like nothing better than to make money off getting kids feel like they're powerful in ways that are completely separate from the society at large. So that, a lot of people want to make money telling a kid it's okay to be good at Grand Theft Auto, a game which I love, by the way. But in the same time, encouraging them to feel alienated from the larger society. And so what I would hate for us to have is a generation of kids who are great at games but have washed their hands of taking political responsibility. I don't think that that's necessarily happening. I'm not saying that's a given, or that games cause it. But I do think we, as people developing, need to take some responsibility for trying, while honoring kids' inventiveness and individuality and singularity, to also try to figure out how to encourage them to integrate with the world, even if it's to change it. So those are just two things that I wasn't going to say, that I'm now going to say. Actually, I've come around to what I did want to say. I didn't plan on showing off the games that I've developed, but I've realized that a lot of people don't know them. There are a series of games about the Zumbinis. I'm just curious, can I see a show of hands how many people do know the games? Yeah, so it's about half. And the only reason I'm going to talk about it, I wasn't really excited to demo my own stuff, but in fact, some of the issues around informal, the interface between entertainment games and school, they work out pretty well in Zumbinis. And I'm not going to say it's the best, that it's the solution, but there really are examples of a game that is that kids play as entertainment that teachers have actually accepted. The history of Zumbinis, by the way, it's a game of logic puzzles with a story framing it about some small blue creatures who are themselves the instantiation of the idea of what data is like. They're multivariate, and I could demonstrate that with pictures, but I don't have them. But the Zumbinis have to make their way through a world in which they encounter one environment after the other, in which you as a player are told nothing. And it doesn't make any sense, and you take actions that are sort of like probes, and you get responses, sometimes successful, sometimes not. And the game is designed so you can keep playing no matter what, but the only way to have real success is to gradually make sense out of the chaotic environments that you find by testing and probing and isolating variables, by discovering what the mechanism in the environment is and then solving for it. It's a game where you don't learn facts because you can play it you can play it over and over again. The solution is different every time. It's a game where you learn strategies. And the fact of the matter is, it's hard work, and yet kids play it avidly. I'm glad you brought up Vygotsky, because I think games are at best hard fun. And so we have examples of that in this game. But we also, the interesting thing is it's a game because its mechanisms are somewhat transparent that teachers actually get. They don't have to learn it beforehand. They watch the kid play it. They begin to observe. It's a game where there's no time pressure. I'm going to sort of segue really briefly because I want to, I know I should cut off soon. We take out time pressure, which means that kids can sit together. They don't fight over the mouse. If they're not fighting over the mouse, they're talking about their solutions. If they're talking, the teacher can sit behind them and listen to what they say. The teacher can even interrupt and say, why did you do that? And it doesn't break the flow of the game. Because actually the flow of the game is to sit and try something and think about it. And the stakes are high enough that you want to succeed, but low enough that you can try a couple different things. So that's a design element that I think we ought to see in games that are looking to bridge this gap. Another one, an important point about games is that is to go back and look at the original, some very early research on kids' play. The work of Peter and Iona Opie looking at schoolyard play in England. And one of the things that they discovered is that kids, within the course of playing a single game, they don't always, sometimes they want to play really hard, sometimes they just want to relax and play. They even want, playing tag, they even want to get caught sometimes. They don't always want to evade the tag. And so the point is that I'm thinking about games in which you have multiple kinds of rewards, so that a player can sometimes can feel accomplished when they do something in a relaxed way and have a different set of accomplishments when they play hard. Never confuse the two. Don't pat someone on the back for something where they didn't really accomplish anything. But if you build in multivariate rewards to the game, players find lots of different ways into it, and then they're really playing. Then it's play. It's not just a game, it's play. The importance of that is if we really want to do games about science or math or history, we cannot, which I think we can do, which I think we ought to do, we nevertheless cannot lose sight of the fact that the kid is playing, that we have to give it all the qualities of play. It sounds really trite, and yet I've been to enough conferences and seen enough demos to know that the play goes pretty quickly in a lot of games which are content rich. The play is gone by the second screen. So I just want to sort of emphasize that feature in a game which looks to bridge this world. Just one last thing, just to say something about the history of our game. It released as a commercial game within a fairly short amount of time. Teachers found it. They began recommending it to parents. Parents began bringing it to teachers. It really is possible for this world of school and all this time it didn't devalue it to kids. I've watched kids playing in classrooms as part of a curriculum, and they're playing it the way they would play it at home. So it is not impossible. It's not impossible that a game meet goals of entertainment and education at the same time. It's hard, but it's not impossible. And so I just want to make a plea for that. And I guess all the other points I was going to make, I'll say for the questions and answers.
Identity and new way of thinking that she had picked up. She was in a program where they were learning to be graphic designers and learned some mathematics along the way. But it wasn't just in her math class. She was interacting with adults and interacting with her peers. She had this identity as an expert. It had just kind of radiated through her entire experience. Now, of course, in school, she was in middle school, so not many of her teachers wouldn't have been the same teachers as the year before, so I don't know that they would have been able to do the comparison. But I can't believe that if you had a teacher who had her 2 years in a row, her Spanish teacher, for example, that teacher wouldn't have noticed some kind of difference, for what that's worth.
I feel guilty. I sort of feel a little guilty about this because I know after developing the game, when it was time to think about instructional materials that might be key to it, it was hard for me to get excited about it at that moment. But in reality, I think as designers, we ought to think harder about how to communicate to teachers and parents about what's going on with the games. Of course, the reality is most of these games are sold pretty much directly to the kids, and the parents never see this stuff. But I think you're really raising, I think if we really want to bridge the gap, then I think we need to do more and better work at communicating about what's in the game.
The only thing I would say is that again, building some tools into these games that let the teacher look inside where the kid's been and what he's been doing is pretty important. It'll probably be a while before we really know what that means, but at least you'd be able to look at what territory had been covered and hadn't, and then you can link that with pre and post testing and see whether you get some correlations, and we've started to see some of that.
Yeah, I don't want to riff forever on the same question, but I mean, Eric, I don't know if you're willing to step in. I mean, a lot of what Eric does is in developing tools and using them with kids, also working with teachers and getting them very actively involved in that process. So some of the linkage is just explicit. As a teacher, you can't really know what your kids are getting out of a game if you don't either understand it or at least know how to either play it with them or know what they're doing when they play it. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, as part of our design research, we include a lot of teachers along the way, and I think other people have talked about. I mean, that serves a dual role, as David alluded to. One is getting them some knowledge of that particular game and what their kids might be learning through that particular game, as well as developing some games literacy for those teachers, because not all of them have played games before. So helping them understand what it is as designers of the game is really helpful in including them in that process. And then it really becomes very explicit.
Yeah, I think I was gonna say something similar to that. I think what I was trying to figure out is the sort of pure case, and the pure case is in some way through some self-guided motivation, a student goes and plays a game, and how do teachers know? And that seems like a very hard case that, I mean, really, could you design for that? I'm not sure. All you can do is make teachers open to that activity as something that's a potential teaching tool or teaching moment when a kid comes in and shows interest or says something about the activities that they do outside of school. Other than that, if you're doing tools that are meant for teachers to be asking their students to do in their after-school activities or field trip guides or curriculum guides to the exhibits we do at the Exploratorium, there's Dr. Sherry Shi, a colleague of mine, is developing an RFID-based system for bookmarking exhibits and having students and visitors in general be able to kind of build a portfolio of the exhibits that they've used. So that's another way in which that could be done if that was open to teachers to have to create portfolios for their students that then they fill with their experiences at the Exploratorium.
I just wanted to take advantage of having these four brains collected on the podium. This is Carrie Heater at Michigan State University, and say, what's totally special about you four as game designers? What's different about designing informal science or informal learning games compared to classroom or commercial games?
I don't know. I would actually. I think some of the mechanisms, we don't have to build some of the mechanisms you need to build if you're going to track performance. That's one practical result. But on the other hand, I think if we're doing our job well in the other areas of the software, it's actually very similar. You have to have really clear ideas what your learning goals are. And you have to make sure that what you're building is in some way related to that. We might have the advantage of being able to be a little bit freer thinking about what our learning goals are. We can kind of like make those up in terms of what we think is important, but the discipline is very similar beyond that point.
We have to fool people more. I mean, we have to fool them into, I mean, maybe this is a gross overstatement, but I mean, in a sense, first of all, getting somebody to, in a self-guided way, first of all, engage in the activity that you're building, and then second of all, to maintain interest. Our exhibits, I mean, Eric was right in the beginning. I mean, our exhibits on average hold people for about 30 seconds. It's kind of hard to get at some of the higher order learning that, games can teach kids, in 30 seconds. I mean, obviously we have exhibits that people spend 10 minutes at, but again, so that's another challenge. And then, in a formal environment, you can explicitly ask people to do things. And for example, to reflect or make meaning or transfer the activity to the real world. And, in an informal environment, at least in a museum, we can do that through a graphic, but we have to be careful about really designing into the activity ways to support that kind of activity.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, we don't ask anything from them and we don't have anything to give them. And that makes it different than those two contexts. We don't actually have to earn money off of them. That makes us free in certain ways, and we don't have to give them a stamp on their forehead that says they did X, Y, and Z that's been approved by the state or some accreditation board, and that gives us yet another degree of freedom. On the other hand, we have to somehow convince them to come in the door still, although I guess the commercial games have that problem too. So we have a lot more freedom in that sense. I don't know that that's special about our brains in particular, but about the context in which we work.
Actually, to talk about a point of similarity, it seems to me that fundamentally the idea when you're taking on a subject matter is to try to not think of it as a subject matter, but to I try to go back and access my childhood and think about the play that was really related to that, to the ways in which I played with numerical ideas, which I think most kids really do, whether they know it or not. You just have to access it, whether it's through Lego blocks and thinking about the size of the blocks. I keep thinking about history games. I keep thinking of going back to dress up or playing with either dress up or playing with toy soldiers, or the degree to which you just situate, not because it's better play, but it may have been at a time that when the play was less complicated, and it's a good place to access as a starting point. And I think that's as true for, across that spectrum that you suggested, from commercial to classroom games.
So one more quick question.
Nicole Lazaro again from Zio Design, and what we look at is, I like to contextualize is that there's sort of the game, and then there's the experience that the game creates. So that's why we talk about player experiences. And if you're designing a player experience, this is what you do as a game designer, how much does the fun that you have from the game, how much of it comes, do you think, from the emotions that the game produces versus, say, like the interaction or the application or divergence from like a real life activity? What do you guys see as the balance? Or have you done any kind of formal researches to try and tease that, what we call player experiences, apart?
I'll say in some of the stuff that we've done actually in our informal learning is the stuff in the game is very, very simple. It's a lot about the interactions that happen between the players inside the game, in the games, the social interactions, the interactions with their environment. So I think one can rely on either end of that, but it is possible to build things that do rely on the real world interactions and the personal interactions, and the game just kind of scaffolds a little bit of that with some fictional content and some story and a little bit of character role play. I don't know if other people have.
I think the answer is, and we have some data that speaks to it, although I won't bore you with it here, but is that it's the alignment of those things. That in fact none of those things actually works in isolation. It's the way in which those things are consistent and coherent and they create feedback loops among one another, which is why I actually think that talking about sort of the game design and the player experience as two separable things in some ways is conceptually problematic. The game is the player experiences of it in the most simple sense. And so if you're going to, when you're designing that, you have to be thinking about all of those, the interactions, the actual properties of the game, the context in which it sits, the things that sit around it, and so forth.
I think that cultural context too. I mean, it's not only the game, the player experience, but it's cultural context too. And I mean, in the beginning, when I was talking about why I play Unreal, I mean, that's one of the major things that I find fun, is the way that it gives me an opportunity to go against some of the cultural things that are expected of me as a person.
Well, one thing about that, we're just squeezing this in at the last second here, but I mean, one of the implications of this, so one of the phrases that you hear all the time is games is anytime, anywhere, on demand. You can learn on demand, you can play on demand. Well, if the game is really all of these things that sit around the game, you can't do it anytime, anywhere, on demand, because there's a whole setting that you have to be a part of. And so once you take that view, that doesn't make them any worse. They're still great, but it's not just something that's in the box that you can just pick up at a moment, because there's a whole set of interactions around it.
I agree with you entirely when you're speaking about a specific game, but I think we might. I mean, if you think about reading, which is a pleasurable activity for most of us. Reading has long ago learned to adapt to all sorts of environments, so that you get the newspaper, and you get there's lots of ways to read, and they are on demand. And so while any one game is going to need to be situated pretty clearly, I think it is worth thinking about varieties of games popping up in different places, and being very attentive to, well, if I'm playing on my cell phone, what is that about? It's not the same. We shouldn't try to recreate the experience of playing at your computer or playing with your friends around on the GameCube. So I think there is a potential for games being everywhere, but a specific game has to be situated. I certainly agree.
I'm going to cut us off because I don't want to run into the next panel, but I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and thanks for the questions.